My name is Emily Amin, and I will be discussing the legal environment of international business, and more specifically in free trades and free trade agreements. And I just want to apologize in case you do hear any noise in the background. I'm doing this from my hotel, which happens to be right off of the freeway in San Diego. So I will go ahead and jump right in. So in summary, free trade is, as we're all aware of, imports and exports are necessary really to economic success in different countries, with us being attached to only two other ones. The trade across seas, is so important, and even with different environments, weather will have a factor on which goods we have in our country and where we might have to get from others. So there's always trade between countries, and with trade being created so often, there is the free trade, where basically countries kind of come together, eliminate those barriers, to allow trade between each other. And there are, so many different agreements between countries, nations, certain areas, which the one in the U.S. that is a large one, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which happens to also be the largest free trade agreement in the world, and that's between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. So while there is this, between us three, each piece kind of has its own separate part. So between our agreement between U.S. and Mexico may be different than what Canada and Mexico, have kind of established. So there is, when they created this back in '94, they had this big promise and expectations of this giant, surplus in the economy, resulting in more jobs and economic growth. But there was some hesitation because the U.S. is, seems as this big powerhouse, and then you look at, and Canada and the U.S. have been really had this trade agreement since 1989. So the U.S. and Canada, are very similar. But then when you kind of look at Mexico and their economy and their jobs, and the poverty line is way below than what we're expected. So there's some hesitation in this on, well, we're going to allow them to have our goods and services. So there was some hesitation, but Mexico's climate is so different than ours that there are other goods that they have to offer, as well as mainly the U.S. kind of, profiting on selling to Mexico on our goods and services, which kind of started to relate, but there was economic growth. The U.S. had about 38%, Canada 30%, and Mexico was right around that 30% as well as increase in our exports to Mexico. But while the U.S. industry is thriving, all of a sudden Canada and Mexico's industries were decreasing. Mexico lost a lot of their revenue, especially with their agriculture, because it was cheaper to import elsewhere, which Mexican farmers started seeing this, and the promised jobs it ended up losing hundreds of thousands of jobs in the first 10 years. And surplus decreased. Another very large one is the European Union. So similar to how we have the North American, and there's the European one that all these countries in Europe are so close together, so they wanted to create this free trade agreement as well to be able to trade in and out with such close borders. And Europe has many more countries, but they're a lot smaller and closely together, so this really could help companies that have in multiple European countries, and instead of having individual markets or changing their company a little bit, they could have this separate locations and manufacturers in different countries. but they still need to comply with each individual country's laws and regulations, and it is growing. There was 13 new countries added since 2004, and 8 of those being in 2004 alone. Agriculture is a huge focus for them as well across their market, and it's different from the US because it's a common market. So they have, they want to focus on that common market versus and creating that. So there are good and bad sides of free trade agreements. And I think that the globalization of the world is creating, where we're probably going to see a lot more, and so many countries have their own, because working together and creating that unity and will help us grow as the globe. But economies are always changing, and this puts pressure on other countries, which we've seen so often when there's wars or disasters. It puts this pressure and can even result in more wars with the trading and kind of isolating other countries out. And like we kind of seen with the North American Free Trade Agreement, is that there also can almost be kind of the power player, like the US is considered. So we're profiting off of these other countries, where they're suffering and they're relying on us for their economy, and that can be a dangerous line as well. As well as if a certain country relies so heavily on a trade with another one, all of a sudden that economy crashes, they're not getting that certain product or good as often anymore, they're probably going to be hesitant on giving all of their resources. So overall, it is extremely important to have those free trade agreements to work together as economies and industries, and realizing that we have different products and goods and services that we can offer, but to also respect other countries and respect that they do have their own economies and that they do need to have different laws and regulations that need to be respected.